Hello, everybody, and welcome to Joshi's Journey into 40K Episode 7. This is probably going to be the last episode of the Journey into 40K, and of course, I'm Josh with Joshi Howard here to take you through the most recent event that we actually played, which was the Riverside Classic GT hosted by the Xenos Petting Zoo over in Riverside, California at GMI Game Store. Before we get too far into this one is probably going to be a little bit longer because we have a lot of games to talk about, and I have a little bit more updates towards some of the goals that we actually had at the end. So if you don't know a whole lot about the 40K part of it, or are just interested in seeing how I actually did, there is a timestamp down in the description for you to check out for a bit of a summary. So because this is the last episode and I'm feeling a little bit better than I was last week where I decided to skip over the list, we are going to take a little bit of time to talk about the list that we were bringing to this GT. Now, of course, because this was a GT, they did post what missions we would be playing for all 5 rounds well in advance of when we actually came into the event. So we would have a little bit of an opportunity to tailor our list to the missions that we knew that we were going to be playing. And the 5 missions that we were playing at this one were in order: tear down their icons, data scry salvage, recover the relics, the scouring, and ending on conversion. Now, for me, I saw this list as a guard player, and I was pretty happy to actually see it because there's not a lot of bad missions in this. Our toughest one is by far Data Scry Salvage in this list of missions. And then the Scouring can be a little bit more difficult, especially if we're going up against a lot of Marine or Marine equivalent armies who are better at melee and have this big opportunity to charge our alliance on turns 2 or 3. But for the most part, I was rather comfortable with most of these missions. The big thing that I was really looking at was how can I try and make sure that I can have as many bodies on the field that I'm comfortable making sure I can hold all of the different objectives. Now, with that in mind, I also do a fair amount of scouting for every event. I will go through and I will take a look at everybody who has signed up for the event. I will take a look at their histories, see what kind of armies they have played in the past, see how strong the field tends to be, and try and tailor what it is that I'm bringing for that. And for this one, I did in fact see that there were a lot of Marine equivalent units and not a whole lot of Guard equivalent units. So not a lot of toughness 3 bodies across the board. It's mostly toughness 4, 3 up save kind of units. And we'll talk exactly about what we did to try and change our list in order to account for that. So to start with, of course, we are, as always, running Lord Solar Leontus with the Grand Strategist Warlord trait, making sure that we can refund command points on a roll of a 5+, up to a maximum of once per battle round. And of course, just such a huge force multiplier for the Kazarkin, for the Rogel Thorn, for the Tank Commander, for anything that's going to be doing a lot of shooting. After that, of course, we are basically required to take, in many situations, a Cadian command squad with the Master Tactician Warlord trait in order to get the 3 redeploys. Now, I have heard some discussion about whether or not it would make more sense to substitute out the Cadian command squad with a Tempestus Scion patrol and command squad there, but to be honest, I was a little bit lazy. I don't have a painted up Tempestus command squad. I don't have all of that, and I had never practiced. I had never tried using that unit before, and I wanted to be very confident in my ability to just pilot my army. So even though I believe a Tempestus Scion command squad might have been a little bit better here, it's not something that I was comfortable with, and I wanted to make sure I could put my best foot forward. It's also worth noting that we did not put the finial on them. The Cadian Command Squad did not take a relic. It was just a pretty much bare bones with the Master Tactician, and they were mostly just there to provide that 24-inch bubble in order to make sure we could keep as many infantry in range of inflexible command as possible. Our third HQ slot was a tank commander with the Gatekeeper Relic Battle Cannon on top, and also something that we haven't done in a lot of our previous games because we chose not to take the finial. We ended up getting the Warlord trait Lead by Example to allow the tank commander to order themselves, and it is definitely a huge buff to the tank commander and his ability to kind of operate with a bunch of other tanks around them as well. The tank commander also came with a Lascannon on the front, multi-meltas on the sides, and just like every other armored vehicle we brought to this list, armored tracks for the +1 save against damage 1 weapons. In no force organization slot, we also took a Commissar with a bolt pistol and power sword. We saw this one, and it's just such a strong unit, just providing that extra officer bubble, providing another unit of Prefectus orders, and creating that 12-inch no deep strike bubble, as well as some like advance and shoot, advance in action, all kinds of weird little combinations of rules that can really help out infantry, especially with doing things like raise the banners or retrieve battlefield data. For our troops, we took 5 units of Cadians with Meltagun, Plasma Gun, Autogun, and the Sergeant, and a Voxcaster. Just your basic guys. We wanted to make sure we could bring at least 5 of these to the event, mostly for Dad's Car Salvage, because we were very confident we could do almost anything else we wanted on the rest of the field. For our elites, we ended up taking 2 units of Kazarkin, and these have been the same that we brought to the past couple of events. They are both identically equipped with the double Melta, double Plasma, and Las weapons across everybody else. 1 unit had the Veteran Guerrillas to ignore cover at 18 inches or less, and the Barbican's Key for the once per game teleport. The other unit had airly weapons for plus 4-inch range on their weapons, and this is the one that we tend to hold back towards our deployment zone behind a piece of obscuring terrain, jump them out over the wall on a subsequent turn with Lord Solar's rerolls, and just shoot anything that gets too close into our lines and making us feel uncomfortable. After that, as we did take elites as our mandatory slot, we ended up taking 2 units of 5 Scions. Both of them had Meltagun, a plasma gun, the sergeant with a plasma pistol and power sword, and a Voxcaster. We also took 1 additional unit of 5 Scions with a plasma gun, a hotshot volley gun, bolt pistol and chainsword, and a Vox. And you might be asking, why did you bring the bolt pistol and the chainsword? The simple answer is, it's what the guy was equipped with, and these guys are here to be action monkeys. All the Scion units are just there to create a little bit more chaos on the battlefield and to run around to do retrieve battlefield data. Now, because they are elites and a unit of 5, they can potentially fail on a 6 when they're doing retrieve battlefield data, but that was a risk that I was willing to take. For fast attack, we again mix things up a little bit here. We saw that there's mostly going to be Marine and Marine equivalent units across most armies, for which our Sentinel Alpha Strike with the 3 heavy flamers, the Maverick maneuvers 1 CP to charge, and all that was not going to be particularly effective. But we cannot leave home without 3 units of Scout Sentinels because it is so good at denying things like Oaths of Moment, Infiltrator deploys, as well as preventing pre-game moves from units like the Votan from getting into your side of the map. So what we did was we took 3 individual Scout Sentinels. 2 of them had plasma cannons and swords, and 1 of them had a flamer and sword, just because we did see that there were some Tau players that the flamer was going to be useful against. In our heavy support slots, we took 2 Lehman Russ battle tanks with Executioner plasma cannons on top, las cannons in the hull, multi-melta sponsons, and armored tracks, of course. These are going to be the workhorses and 2 of our main damage output units across the entire field. Our last slot that we took, our last heavy support, is a Rogel Thorn battle cannon with the Oppressor battle cannon, as well as the coaxial autocannon in the on the turret. 2 extra heavy stubbers, the Pulverizer mini battle cannon in the hull, multi-melta sponses, and of course the Vontae Praetorian tank ace to allow itself to give orders to itself as well as give orders to other tanks. And it creates a situation where we have another officer to create a bubble and make it so much easier for us to make sure that we are actually getting everybody within our inflexible command range. Let's talk about the lay of the land a little bit. We've already heard about the list. So, what was actually at the event? We were playing at GMI Games in Riverside, California, at an event hosted by the Xenos Petting Zoo. And honestly, we had a couple of great TOs there. In particular, I remember there was Jason McKenzie and Camden Holt of Jason is from Xenos Petting Zoo, and Camden is from the Riverside Ripper Swarms. And I believe the other most vocal TO was, I think his name was Steven? Or Steve. It was one of the two, but I didn't talk to him quite as much, but he was doing a lot of the announcing and all that kind of stuff. And every single time when we had questions, they were very prompt. They are very knowledgeable players, and it was great just having them come around. And I remember even during the event, I would later ask Jason, hey, you know, I really struggle to just kind of like look at a board and have a good idea of like how the game is going, who's winning, anything like that. And I asked him, like, hey, can you do that? Can you just like look at a board and have a pretty good idea of, you know, what the state of the game is? And he was like, nah, not in this edition. There are too many different things. There's so many secondaries and everything like that, which makes it impossible to tell. Let's talk about terrain a little bit. Now, XPZ was providing a lot of terrain, and it was very consistent across every board, which was nice. You had one really large piece of L-shaped ruin with no windows on the first floor. You had one really big L-shaped ruin, which had a very similar footprint a lot of the time, but it had windows the entire way, so it was a little bit harder to hide things behind. You would really have to push things back because as soon as you're touching that terrain, you're going to get shot. And then there was a mix of dense cover as well as every table also had one smaller piece of obscuring that was tall, but also had windows, and so it wasn't the best for hiding like tanks and larger units, but it was perfectly suited to hide small units of infantry in particular. Of the 30 players that were at this event that actually participated, there were 3 players here who were in the top 100, 3 additional players who were in the top 500, including me, and 5 players in the top 1,000. 4 of the players had no listed events prior to this one in the ITC season, but ultimately, the vast majority of players had been to 2 or more events previously, and so it was, well, maybe not the most stacked event, which I have seen at some of the RTTs that we've had around here. It was a pretty darn strong event overall. Even though not everybody was in the top 1,000, we had a lot of players in the top 2,000, the top 3,000 that were really in a spot where they were real threats to most people outside of maybe the very best at the event. For what it is worth, before the event started, I was the 5th highest rated player at the event by the ITC ranking, and the 7th highest rated if you instead ranked by points earned per event. So let's go ahead and get into game number 1. In game number 1, I ended up playing up against Austin and his Khorne Demons. Now, before we actually start talking about his list and the actual game itself, it is worth noting that this is the 3rd time I've played Austin in different tournaments. The first time I played at an Odyssey RTT, and I played up against his Imperial Knights, and I did win that one. The second time I played him at the GMI Games in the same location as this one that we just played at the GMI Games RTT, and I lost there in the guard mirror. And it was actually one of the things that convinced me to start putting multi-meltas on every single tank, just because of how efficient they are, especially going up against things like big bugs or other vehicles, and even sometimes more elite infantry. So this was going to be our 3rd meeting, but we'll talk about his list real quick. He had told me at the previous time that we were playing that this was going to be his last event playing Imperial Guard in 9th edition. Instead, he was going to be playing Khorne Demons, or at least some version of Demons, going into this GT. And he lived up to that in the event, or the list that he actually brought was a Bloodmaster, a Skulltaker, Be'lakor, a Bloodthirster, Scarbrand, 4 units of 10 Bloodletters, 1 unit of 5 Fleshhounds, 1 unit of 4 Fleshhounds as well. We ended up playing this mission on Tear Down Their Icons, which does have the tertiary objective of planting bombs on the other side via actions, and everyone that is not dealt with at the end of the game is worth 4 points to the primary. It's also Control 1, Control 2, Control more in order to score your 12 points of primary per turn. This mission is generally pretty okay for the guard. The actual planting bombs of it, in my experience, if you're planting bombs, you have already largely run away with the game a lot of the time. And because of that, because there's no tertiary, it's hard for guard to completely max out on the primary, but we are going to fairly consistently be getting 32 points at least, because we're going to be controlling both of the objectives on effectively our short edge and getting 8 points off of the Control 1, Control 2 fairly consistently. And so, while we're not going to be maxing out primary every single time, we're going to be doing fairly well on it, and so that's where our relatively strong secondary game can really kick in. Speaking of, for secondaries, I end up going with, I don't remember exactly who said it, but orders, quarters, and battlefield data. So boots on the ground is your quarters, and flexible command is your orders, and retrieve battlefield data was what we actually brought. We recognized that there weren't a ton of units on the side of Austin's board, and that did mean that there were going to be large gaps all over the place for us to just drop scions, go down, and pick up those servo skulls. Austin's secondaries were Assassination, which surprised me a little bit. Reality Rebels, which is kind of like Boots on the Ground. You get points for every table quarter in the center that you have at least the same number of units in as your opponent. And it also scores turn 1, which Boots on the Ground does not. And also raise banners. Now, I'll be honest, looking at basically everybody that was playing at the event, this was the list that I was probably the most worried about, simply because demons for Imperial Guard tends to be rather difficult, especially if they get first turn, because they can teleport a lot of units in. Their deep strikes are very scary, and because they're really based on our leadership, the relatively low leadership of Imperial Guard units does mean that it is harder for us to actually protect a lot of our borders, shall we say. The other thing that made me a little bit worried about was the Bloodthirster was one of not that many phase cap units that were actually at this event. I believe the only one that I saw was an Orc player who was playing Gazgul. And so the lack of Finial meant that it was going to be relatively difficult for me to actually deal with the Bloodthirster this game because it was a phase cap of 8 and with, I believe, more than 24 wounds, it meant that I could not kill it consistently in 3 turns, which meant that it was almost definitely going to be getting in relatively consistently. But as we actually went in, I did end up getting the first turn, and I did allow me to set up my 12-inch no deep strike bubbles using Perfectus orders with the Commissar and Lord Solar, which made it much more difficult for some of the upcoming deep strikes that we're going through. The teleport that they do have as I believe it's Psychic, was not going to be nearly as impactful early on. But the interesting thing that I actually did was on my first turn, I used my Kazarkin not to do damage to any of his big demons, but I actually used them to go off to one side in the southeast corner of the map and killed a bunch of bloodletters so that they could not put up a banner and they were not going to be threatening to just sit on the south that the game actually played out. Because even though I put in a fair amount of shooting into the Bloodthirster, hit the phase cap there, and did some damage just kind of across the board to a bunch of different units, I didn't kill a whole lot other than the Bloodletters. But what ended up happening on Austin's turn 1 was the Bloodthirster was far enough away that it was not going to be able to charge into my lines, and so it had to turn around and basically by itself go kill all the Kazarkin. And it did heal off a couple of wounds, getting all of those kills, but it was a spot where suddenly the Bloodthirster is walking backwards, and for me, that is a huge boon. On my second turn, I actually used a couple more silencers, kind of drop over in the back line, try and block out the Bloodthirster and make it difficult for them to actually get into the rest of my core lines, and also score a couple of boots on the ground points. But the most interesting part of this game was after Be'lakor was shot to death before it even gets to my lines, Skarbrand comes in, and Skarbrand makes their long charge, and they get into my Leman Russ battle tank, and Austin did something cool where he used his sweep attack profile instead of his strike attack profile to hit the Leman Russ battle tank. Because, as Austin was telling me, Skarbrand, if he gets in and he is locked in combat, if you want to fall back, you have to roll under your leadership on 3d6. And for a Leman Russ battle tank, which has a leadership of like 7, that's not happening. So he was able to get in, do some damage to the Leman Russ on his turn. On my turn, I wasn't able to get the Leman Russ out, and so he just got stuck in there. And so on my turn, the Skarbrand was able to kill the Leman Russ battle tank. But after realizing that, and despite the fact that Skarbrand has wings, his wings don't work, so he does not have the ability to fly, which meant that I could just kind of create a circle around him with a bunch of little guys and make sure that Skarbrand wasn't going to get into a whole lot of useful things. I even set up, and this was a bit of a mistake, I set up Lord Solar to go in for a charge because I didn't know or didn't realize that Skarbrand was going to be ignoring Lord Solar's invulnerable saves. And so Skarbrand does end up getting a couple of points there for Austin on Assassination, but that was the only character they killed, and I eventually pick up the Bloodthirster, and I was never really under a ton of threat this game, especially once I recognized that Skarbrand was not going to be a threat to most of my army. I could take one unit of guardsmen, wrap it around him, say, hey, cool, you're gonna kill this. Next turn, all right, here's another unit of guardsmen, you're gonna kill this. All right, cool. All of my really important stuff is never going to be in a position where Scarbrand will be able to deal with it. And so I end up winning my first game against the list I was most worried about, 83 to 68. And this game was fun. Like, Austin's a pretty good guy. You know, he was cheering for me after that because he's like, oh, it would be so much better to have lost to the winner of the event. And also, you know, because it was our third time playing each other, we had a little bit of rapport to go with there as well. But that was the one I was most worried about. As we start getting set up for game two, we know we're going into Data Scry Salvage. And we pair into Robert and his Tau. And Robert is bringing in unusual list. So firstly, they're playing Farsight Enclaves with Commander Farsight, Commander in a Cold Star suit, 2 units of 9 Breachers, 1 unit of 10 Fire Warriors, 1 unit of Crisis suits with 4 Marker Lights, and 6 Shield Drones, 2 units of 4 Hounds, 1 unit of 3 Broadsides, a Hammerhead, Devilfish, and the most interesting thing was 2 Sun Shark Bombers. And I didn't really know what the Sun Shark Bombers did. What I learned from him before the game actually started up was that they moved basically anywhere they wanted on the map. Anything they flew over, he could roll to make them take some mortal wounds, and they would be doing a bunch of. But the other thing about flyers is because of the Arks of Omen rules, they cannot start on the battlefield. They must start off the battlefield in strategic reserves, and for most of them, that means that on turn two, they don't do a whole lot. They can't be where they want to be. They can't necessarily shoot the things that they want to shoot. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that actually affected the game as we go forward. We were on Data Scry Salvage, where it is a Control 2, Control 3, Control More for your primary, and then your tertiary objective is the Data Tether. You do an action on your home objective, and for every objective in the No Man's Land, you will score 1 point, up to a maximum of 3 that you control at the end of your turn. This is a tough mission for Guard, the toughest one in the lineup. But the big thing here for me that I was lucky to see was that I was not up against a Space Marine list. And I was actually up against something that also kind of sucks at melee and doesn't necessarily have the easiest opportunity to try and take objectives from you super aggressively. They tend to also like to kind of stay back. For secondaries, I go again with orders, quarters, and this time banners. So flexible command, boots on the ground, and raise the banners high. For Robert, they took decisive action, aerospace targeting relays, and bring it down. Decisive action, depending on whether you go Montka or Kaoyan, you do need to control half or more of the objectives on the field during your chosen period of the game. Aerospace targeting relays, you need to have infantry do an action next to the midpoint of each board edge in order to score up to a maximum of 15 points there, with increasingly more points based on how many of them you do. And of course, bring it down. Now, my list does max out on 12 bring it down points, 3 points for our Rogel Dorn, 2 points for the 2 Lehman Russes and the Tank Commander, and 1 point for each Sentinel for a maximum of 12. Ultimately, I will kind of gloss over this one because it was interesting, but not a lot actually happened, I suppose I should say. It was the game that I've played where both sides had the most units and like the greatest percentage of their army still on the board at the end of the game. And for me, I kind of knew going into this one was that the onus is not on me. I do not have to do anything to win this game. I'm going to score 15 points on flexible command. If I play reasonably well, I'm going to be scoring 8 to 12 points on boots on the ground, basically not doing anything. And for banners, he needs to come take away objectives from me in order to tear down my banners. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to go take his objectives. I will happily score 8 points in the regular primary, 2 points on the data tether every turn for a total of 40 primary points just on its own. He has to come to me, and decisive action, if you go Cao Yan, you're trying to control 3 objectives or more in turns 3, 4, and 5, which is means that he needs enough units left on the board to control that many objectives at the end of the game. And that means he can't be super aggressive relatively early on in the game. Aerospace targeting relays is also one where he will max out at 9 if he does not come over to my board edge and take that objective, do an action on it, which means he has to come very far across the board. Um, I end up going second on this, which normally is not good for the guard, and definitely for me. It is worth noting that I actually have over, I want to say like 15 to 20 games. I have a 100% win rate in tournaments going first, but I only have about a 50% win rate going second. But this was a game where going first didn't allow Robert to do anything. I think he picked up a sentinel or two, and that was really about it. Which meant that on my swing back, I thought to myself, if I can kill the hammerhead and open up these firing lanes for my tanks, they will trade fine into the broadside battle suits, and nothing else is really a ranged threat up against my tanks. Partly because I can pop smoke, I can pop a blade of plating in order to make sure that the crisis suits will not be doing meaningful damage to my Lehman Russes, and definitely not going to be doing meaningful damage to the Rogel Dorn unless I roll very poorly on saves. So on my first turn, I take my tank commander with Gatekeeper and the Kazarkin, and they jump off to kill the Hammerhead. And they do a smattering of damage to other units. And ultimately, I'm not convinced that like this wasn't the best point for point trade I could have made with the Kazarkin, but it killed off a unit that really allowed my tanks to operate kind of with impunity for most of the rest of the game. Turn 2, Robert brings in his Sun Sharks in his back corner of the board. And I remember him asking, hey, what's the range on the guns that you have on your tanks? And I was like, well, the plasma tanks, they have 36 inches. My Lascannons are 48 inches. But the Gatekeeper battle cannon has a 72-inch range. If it can see it, it can shoot it. I don't remember if that is exactly corner to corner, but it is effectively corner to corner on the board. And the Rogel Thor battle tank has a 90-inch range for whatever reason on its main gun. And that means that it is corner to corner. If it can see it, it 100% can shoot it. And flyers don't get the benefit of obscuring, which means that the Rogel Thor doesn't really need to come out in order to shoot anything. And so in turn 2, he brings both Sun Sharks in his back corner, and his broadsides open up, and they kill my tank commander that had come out to try and kill the Hammerhead. But the tank commander doesn't explode. I spend my 1 CP, and the tank commander shoots its main gun right on back and shoots it at one of the Sun Sharks, and does half of the Sun Sharks' HP in just one round of shooting on my opponent's turn. Then, on my turn 2, the Rogel Dorn opens up with its 90-inch main gun and shoots that same Sunshark out of the sky. Now, I probably should have put the main gun into the other Sunshark, but I was not confident that I would kill it, and I would rather have one dead Sunshark than 2 bracketed Sunsharks. And ultimately, it is unclear to me if I made the right decision there, but having killed one Sunshark before it even did anything, felt pretty okay with the decision overall. Turn 3, he zips the one remaining Sunshark over because it's got, I think he said like 60 inches of movement. And one of the most interesting parts of the game comes through here, and the only time where I remember the roll specifically, because the Sunshark zips over, it does like 4 mortal wounds or something to the tank because he rolled slightly above average for the mortal wound bombs as it goes over. And during his shooting phase, I remember spending 3 CP here for smoke and a blade of plating. And then I roll to see if I refund any of those, and I do not, which is rough because I really wanted one of those CP back in order to be a bit more aggressive on my turn 3. But as he rolls, he had done enough that my tank command, or the tank that he was shooting at, was on 8 wounds. And he rolls his normally damaged 3 weapons, now damaged 2, to try and take down the tank. And I have a 3-up save against these. And I roll 4 2s on 6 dice. and my tank just dies. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, that was a lot of CPI invested, and I was pretty confident that most of the time it would keep the tank alive. But hey, that's why we play a dice game. The tank does end up dying. But on my next turn, I shoot it out of the sky. My remaining Lehman Russ also opens up and kills the remaining broadsides. And from this point on, there's no real remaining threats for Robert. He spent a lot of his time moving not towards my like northwest double objectives, but instead moving from the southeast to try and get towards my home objective. And that was just too much space in order for him to move like Commander Farsight and his Commander in Cold Star to actually get onto my home objective and start denying points there. And after the Sunsharks were dead, with the broadsides dead, with the Hammerheads dead, there wasn't enough remaining threats for him to kill everything off of my objectives. And I feel like they were probably on the wrong side of the board. And I mean, the game kind of ended. We spent 3 turns like not really doing a whole lot other than shooting at Sunsharks and getting shot by Sunsharks. And then he was never able to get the third data tether. He was never able to get me off of my side of the board. And even though he did max out decisive action, didn't get a whole lot of points on bring it down. So it did mean that I ended the game 95-7. Overall, relatively interesting game, and I really did enjoy playing up against Robert. He seemed like a really good guy. I enjoyed looking at his. It was a really cool like brownish red for all of his Tau and like kind of the Farsight colors he had gone for. But overall, it ended up just being kind of a straightforward win for that one. Which does bring us to game 3. We're going to playing up against another Tau player, this time going by the name of RJ. And RJ was bringing another kind of unusual Tau list. He was playing the Cecilia Sept, which meant that basically everything was benefiting from dense cover. He had a commander in a Cold Star. He had a commander in a Crisis Suit. An Ethereal with the Feel No Pains and the command point generation. A Kroot Shaper with the 12-inch No Deep Strike bubble. 1 unit of 5 Crisis Suits with only 3 Shield Drones. 2 units of 4 Hounds. 2 units of 2 Tetras. 2 units of 5 Vespids. 1 unit of 3 Broadsides. And a Riptide. And it had some gorgeous effects on it, right? It had like the missiles coming out of the pod. It had like a really big like blue energy shield that it was also throwing up. But we were also playing this one on Recover the Relics, which is the best mission in the Arks of Omen for the Imperial Guard, because we only need to control 2 of the 6 objectives in order to get 8 primary points. It's control 1, control 2, control more with 8 objectives. And the other part is that it's a kill points tertiary. For every unit that you kill from the other side, you get 1 point up to a maximum of 3 per battle round, which meant that even if we're getting only 32 points on the regular primary, if we kill 3 units every turn, that'll give us 47 primary points. And we only need to kill 13 units on the other side of the board in order to max out on primary. For secondaries, I went with fairly standard stuff: Inflexible Command, Boots on the Ground, and Banners, because I had 3 objectives on my side of the board, and if I can have all 3 of them up for most of the game, like that's an easy 15. If I can keep 2 of them up for most of the game, that's an easy 10. RJ, for his part, took no prisoners, decisive action, and banners. And I will admit I was rather surprised by the no prisoners, because if he kills every single infantry unit in my army, it's worth, I think, like 8 or 9 points. It's not a lot, but it was the one that RJ did choose to take. And I think part of that is because he didn't have great units to actually kill my tanks, right? Like, it's mostly the Riptide and the Broadsides, and the Riptide is okay at shooting tanks, and it's really just the Broadsides to actually kill my my vehicles. But anyway, this game was also weird. I will talk about it in a bit. I ended up going first on this one, and I used my Kazarkin to drop onto the other side of the map and shoot at his Crisis Suits. And RJ pops the stim injectors and takes all the damage on the chassis on the Sergeant. The Sergeant, I believe, exactly dies after making some fantastic Feel No Pain saves altogether. And at this point, I make a call that I still regret, uh, even to now. And that is after all of my shooting is done, and after I say I have no charges left to make, I point over to the crisis suit blob, which had only the sergeant die, and maybe a couple shield drones. And I say, hey, with the shield drones and the crisis suit commander dying, or not the commander, but the sergeant dying here, this crisis suit's no longer in coherency, right? Doesn't that mean it's destroyed? And he ends up picking it up, but I know that undoubtedly kind of killing an extra crisis suit for free, it undoubtedly helps me quite a bit because those are a lot of his firepower. But I could also tell that I had lost the trust of sportsmanship coming from my opponent. And definitely would not say that the environment became hostile, but I would definitely say that the environment stopped being friendly. Um, and while both of us were mostly cordial for the rest of the game, it definitely became a situation where I could tell that we were both just there to try and win the game. And I don't know, I didn't have a lot of fun from that spot. And it's my fault. And I did apologize to RJ after the game. I talked to a couple other players and TOs about it after the game, and different players had like different things to say. I know some people were like, "Yeah, I mean, it's an event, right? Like, if it would meaningfully change the outcome of the game, like these small mistakes, I will have different opinions on it." Or like, "Yeah, it's not necessarily about exactly what you do, but how you do it." And I don't feel like I was particularly aggressive about it, but it was definitely a spot where it was just out like just a little bit too far, like maybe 2.25 inch instead of the 2 inches of coherency. And I was tired. It was very hot. Unfortunately, GMI Games is not particularly well air conditioned. Um, and again, it lost the trust of sportsmanship from my opponent. And there was at least one point where um, I moved some units in the wrong order. I made an advance roll, and I go, "Oh crap! I was supposed to move this tank first." And well, I remember asking, "Hey, do you mind if I just say this unit moves first?" And he says, "Based on the technicality with the coherency, I think I'm going to hold you to it." And I tell him, "That's fair." And then from kind of that point on, we mostly just play, right? There's not a whole lot of crosstalk at that point. We mostly just say things to each other. I remember I think it was like battle round 3 or 4. Um, I'm rolling some attacks with a turret weapon on a tank, and um, he's supposed to be benefiting from dense cover, and I roll some attacks, and I don't remember picking up any threes when they're supposed to be hitting on fours, but Archer says you definitely picked up some fours there. Um, and I remember asking him, was like, what do you want? What would you like me to do? As it was, I had 4 wounds over the 8 shots. And he's like, no, don't worry about it. I'll just take the saves. And I say, no, 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 no. Don't do that. I'm not trying to like get extra shots. Um, what? How about we half it, right? Because like the three, like two threes were rolled, and if we just assume that they both, um, that both of them would have been wounds, then we'll be good. We're gonna be back to a spot that makes sense. And so, he ends up rolling the 2 saves. But I'll be honest, guys, this game was not terribly interesting. The most interesting part of the game was actually when I spend a lot of shooting at the Riptide and leave it on a single wound. But that means it's basically acting at its top bracket on its turn anyway. And I was a little bit worried because I had had something very similar happen in my favor going up against Kyle's Chaos Knights at a previous event where my tank commander sitting on 1 wound for 3 turns ended up picking up a Chaos Knight per turn. I was like, oh no, is this thing going to kill a couple Lehman Russes? I think it does kill one back, and then my Lehman Russ shoots on death, and it was a whole thing. But ultimately, on this mission, my position was never really jeopardized. But there was not a ton of units on the side of RJ's Tau to really take any of my objectives. But he also didn't have a ton of units for me to shoot at for the tertiary points, so kind of evened out a little bit. And we did a little bit of jockeying for a position, but ultimately, I don't even think we ended up taking a single objective from the other player the entire game. I think no, I took one objective from him briefly because I had an objective secure unit at the beginning of the turn of his command phase, so I did tear down a banner for like a turn on like turn 4 or 5. But ultimately, um, the game was mostly just kind of a jockeying game, and what I've kind of come to realize is that the Tau versus Guard game is kind of a game of chicken for a lot of it, and this one ended up being one in my favor on one of my best missions, and so it ended up being 89 for the Imperial Guard to 83 for RJ's Tau. And I would be surprised if he's watching this, but RJ, again, I'm sorry. I hope that that doesn't mean that we can't have good games again in the future. Um, yeah, I don't normally play like that. That was probably the most unsportsmanlike thing I've done in a while, and I to this day, multiple days later, I still feel bad about it. So once again, I'm sorry. But with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start talking about Game 4. Game 4, it is worth noting that because it is a grand tournament, you play 3 games per day. And so that means that we had games 1, 2, and 3 on Saturday, and Game 4 did start on Sunday. It was going to be our first game of the day. But based on the player pack that we had received, it said that it was going to be ranked pairings on day 2, meaning that the number 1 was going to be playing against the number 2, and the number 3 was going to be playing up against the number 4. And I was currently sitting at 3-0, which meant that I was currently ranked third, or I was placed third, I suppose. Um, but because the number 1 and the number 2 were going to be playing for game 1, that meant that I was going to be playing game 4 up against the person below me, which was Brian and his Custodes. Now, it is worth noting that at this point in time, Brian was 2-1. They had lost a game previously, but because there were no other 3-0 players left other than me and the first and the second place players, I ended up pairing down into Brian. And Brian is a player that I had seen at almost all of the events that I had gone to so far, just because he goes to a ton of different events. And I remember, I remember thinking that this is a player that if I could play against anyone else on this upcoming mission, I would have a better chance of winning. And I end up playing against him on the Scouring. And on the Scouring, it is a shortage deployment, which is good for the guard. But because all of the objectives are in no man's land, even though they hang into your own deployment zone ever so slightly, it's really easy for melee armies to charge from one objective to the other in 1 or 2 turns, right? You can get into your opponent's side fairly early on. Let's talk about Brian's Custodes real quick. Now, Brian only runs 23 models in his entire list. He has a Shield Captain on the Dawn Eagle jet bike, a Trajan Valoris, 3 units of 3 Custodian Guards, 2 Contemptor Achilles Dreads, a Vexless Praetor with the Vexilla Magnifica, the one that has the aura of dense cover, the -1, and 3 units of 3 Virtus Praetors, the big old bikes that have kind of the crack missiles and just move 14 inches and just do a ton of damage. Ultimately, I had a lot of time to prep for this because I could look up his list, I could do some research on the Custodes the night before, and I came up with a bit of a different game plan going into this one. My general game plan was that Custodes do not have enough things. They don't have enough units to effectively zone me out and prevent me from scoring maximum on raised battlefield data. But the other primary secondary that guard goes is oftentimes banners. And I know if I go second, the bikes are probably going to deny me 12 primary points or more on just a couple of objectives because I will probably only hold one. And additionally, they're going to make it very hard for me to hold banners if I end up going second. And so, what I ended up doing, what I ended up planning to do is I was going to take battlefield data, and instead of using my sentinels to screen out the middle of the board, I was going to park them right in front of my different objectives, such that if they came in, they would have to charge around it, they would have to try and move around it, and if they did so, they were either not going to be on my objective for a turn, or if they did get onto my objective, they would have to go over the wall and make sure that all four of my tanks would be able to see them. My Kazarkin, which were hiding behind, would be able to jump from one side of the wall to the other in order to shoot down anything that was coming in from that side of the map. Now, this plan, would it have worked if Brian had gone first? It's hard to say. I thought it was my best chance. I was really worried about this game just because I knew that Custodians, if they get into their melee range, they're going to be very difficult to get out. They are so tanky. But I went first. And there was one spot here where I was actually really worried about how the game might end up going because I have 3 redeploys, but because I go first, I won first turn, it does mean that I do my redeploys first, and then Brian, who has 2 redeploys, takes his 2 redeploys afterwards. And so I take a bunch of tanks, and I move them over to one side of the map for a potential alpha strike. And he starts moving his units around, and I go, oh no. I know that I've set these tanks over here, but if they don't get their damage off, if they don't do anything on turn 1, they are out of position for the rest of the game. They are not likely to be able to help if Brian chooses to go towards the other side of the map because they're not going to have firing angles at all. But what I did end up doing was I was able to get 3 tanks, including the tank commander, so the 2 plasma tanks and the tank commander, were all able to draw a line of sight into 1 bike squad. The front 2 tanks, the 2 plasma tanks, because I had them a little bit farther forward, because I was because everything of Custodians is like a 2-up armor save and a 4-up invulnerable save. I didn't care about the extra AP that was being provided here by the plasma cannon. I cared more about the longer range and the strength 9 instead of strength 8 to wound, I think, the regular Custodian guards on 2s instead of on 3s. And so I deployed them a bit farther forward. Both of them were able to shoot into a second squad of bikes, and the Kazarkin, which I used the Barbican's key for, were able to hit all 3 units of bikes, a couple of Custodians, and if I had killed enough things with the tanks, then potentially the Kazarkin would be able to shoot at Trajan, would be able to shoot at the Vexillus Praetor. So we go in, they pop over, and I kill 4 or 5 bikes on turn 1. And that is 400 points of most of his force projection dead on turn 1. And even though, right, like Custodian Guard, like they're decent units, but they are slow. They're 6 inches. They don't have great shooting. They don't have great tools to move across the board. Like, he's got his shield captain. He's got a unit of 1 bike. He's got a unit of 3 bikes. And even if he yeets those over to my side of the board, they're not getting in. They're not going to be killing Lord Solar, right? And because he had taken Auric Mortalis, the one where you kill the Supreme Commander for if you do it, you get 5 points. If you do it in melee, you get another 5 points. And if you do it outside of your own deployment zone, you get another 5 points for a maximum of 15. He's not getting to Lord Solar. He's not going to kill Lord Solar. Behind enemy lines, the other secondary that he had taken, he's not scoring. He's just like maybe he scores 3 to 6 points on this if he budgets his bikes well. The only secondary he's going to be scoring is going to be banners this game, and even though he's going to do well on primary because he's going to control his 2 home objectives and he's going to control the middle one with some really durable obsec units out of line of sight, I don't care, right? Like, I'm going to be scoring 32 points on my primer as long as I don't lose my two objectives. I'm going to be scoring an additional 3 for the middle objective and my two home objectives with Auspex scans. And then if I can get one more, I'm already sitting at 41. That'll give me 44 points of primary. And the rest of the game mostly just becomes Brian, like, taking the southern board edge and dealing with the scions that I throw at him, dealing with the tanks that have moved up a little bit too far. He does end up killing 2 of the Lehman Russes, but because he's spending all of his units on the southern board edge, I fall everything back, and from that point, I'm basically like, well, you have to come to me. You now have to take my objectives, and even though a lot of your force is dead or dying, I just need to make sure that I'm never scoring less than 8 points on primary every single turn, and this game should be in the bag. And it kind of was. And I know, guys, we are flying through these 4 games so far, but so many of them were effectively determined on the first or second turn, right? The demons had to send their bloodthirster flying backwards towards their own objectives in order to try and deal with Kazarkin. Game 2, I killed a Sunstrike before he even did anything. I killed a Hammerhead before he even got to shoot. All of his big guns didn't get to shoot. My tanks were uncontested. Game 3 was probably the closest game, but it was still a game where he was not able to actually get to my home objectives at all because he didn't have strong melee. He didn't have a ton of strong force projection. He was another army that kind of relies on your opponent being aggressive, and I was just going to outscore him passively in the secondaries. And this one where Brian, after the first turn was like, well, I guess I have 2 dead secondaries that I'm going to score maybe a combined 3 points on. The game was effectively over on turn 1. And he even said afterwards, like, when you do have these kind of games where you're playing Custodes and you lose 68 to 93, you kind of recognize, like, yeah, it's like, this game was mostly determined on a single dice roll. Who's going to be going first? Who's going to be taking the board control? Who's going to be moving forward? And because the guard won it, there was not a whole lot left for the Custodes to do because of how much damage we can do with our one trick. I'd also like to say Brian seemed like a great guy. I talked to him a fair amount over the event. We would check in on each other, like, "Hey, how'd you do in your game? Are things going well? Are you looking for these big opportunities to fight? Like, how is all of this working out?" And we traded some stories about, like, horror stories of other people that we had run into. It was like, oh no, yeah, I remember at this event, like, somebody almost got in a fight, or like, oh, this guy said something really funny to me at a previous event. But overall, good. Game was pretty short lived, but the actual player was one of the more enjoyable events, or one of the more enjoyable opponents I have had so far. And so, if you've been keeping up and you're getting all of your painting done at this point, you do know that I am 4-0 after taking down Brian and his Custodes, and that means that we go to lunch. And I sit down, and I sit across from a guy named Eric Chen, who I recognized from the event. I hadn't played against him, but I was like, hey, how you doing? Do you mind if I sit here with you? I was mostly doing it because, guys, I was so nervous going into my last event, or going into my last game, because I knew a couple things. One, we were on conversion. Conversion is a mission where if guard goes first, we're almost guaranteed to win because it is so hard to prevent our tanks from shooting into a bunch of important units. Also, our Kazakhin are going to be shooting a bunch of really big things as well. Also, because it's controlling no man's land, I can move all of my infantry in order to get over towards the northwest objective, lock that one down, and then just hide there for the rest of the game. That's if I go first. Other part of this is I had taken a look at Alex's list, and let's go over that real quick. He had a champion, he had a high call, he had a regular call, he had 5 Hearthguard with the grenade launchers and the Vulcanite mortal wound shooting things. He had a unit of 10 Hearthkin that was split into 2 units of 5 with 2 Sagittars. He had 1 unit of 5 Pioneers with Hylas, one of them. 2 units of 6 Pioneers, each with 2 Hylas in the works. And he had 2 units of 5 Thunderkin with Grav Cannons. And I had remarked to one of my other friends at this point, I don't know how this Votan list is supposed to beat me. It doesn't have a land fortress. It doesn't have like great threat into my tanks until my tanks have killed enough units that they've racked up some judgment tokens. And as like a Votan player, you don't have that many units to lose, right? If you lose a unit of bikes, I mean that is, I don't want to say a third of your army, but like it's kind of close to it, you know. Especially because they're the ones who are taking board control for you. And so I look at this one, and I know if I go first, I'm almost guaranteed to win. This map is pretty darn good for me because we are playing it on conversion, right? It's control 1, control 2, control more, hold no man's land. But being favored in the game, just on like a pure math, like not taking into account player skill, I'm very nervous because I know that I have only won one other event, and that was the Game Ogre. That was the episode, I think it was episode 1 that I did it about. And this was a much higher prestige event, right? The Riverside Classic is a second annual event run by Xeno's Petting Zoo. And I was going to be in a room that was going to be streamed. And I will put a link down below in the description if you do want to watch the whole thing, because it is currently still up on twitch.tv/Xenos Petting Zoo _. But I was nervous because I was going to be on stream, and also Jason McKenzie, who idolize is a strong word, but very much look up to as a player because of how well he's done and the fact that he absolutely clobbered me in my first event that I ever went to. He's going to be there. He's going to be watching the entire game. And I just felt like I was going to be judged not just by a very strong player who I looked up to, but also everybody else in the XPZ Discord were going to be watching, and I was just so nervous. And that's, I mean, Jason even says, like, why are you nervous? Like, your job is you go up and stand in front of people on camera. And, you know, I did my best to kind of shake it out, and there's another part of me that's like, I'm super favored on paper to win this. I just need to convert. On conversion. Let's start talking about the actual game. For secondaries, I took the 3 standard that we took at this. Boots on the ground, inflexible command, and retrieve battlefield data. My opponent, Alex Spatho, ended up going, the ancestors are watching, lay claim, and bring it down. In ancestors, you get points for every unit you destroy in a different phase. And you lose points at the end of the game for every unit that still has judgment tokens at the end of the game. Lay claim, you give your opponent 3 objective markers, and they will place it down across the board. And you will get 5 points for every one of those objective markers that you control at the end of the game. And it's an interesting one. I've heard other Votan players, like I know Camden Holt, who was one of the TOs, and also another very strong Votan player, was saying that he hates lay claim and would far prefer to take behind enemy lines in the vast majority of games. But Spatho, Alex, was a player who's like did not believe in behind enemy lines at all and was a big proponent of lay claim. So it's very clearly something that is divisive amongst the Votan community. But anyway, I want to do something a little bit different with this game. And if you already look at the ITC things, if you're watching this from the Xenos Petting Zoo Discord, if you are watching this in general as somebody that I talk to, you already know that I lose this game. And I lose this one in a very close score of 62 to 69. So instead of talking about the game kind of in general, I've spent so much time going back and thinking about how I could have won this game. And there are 4 mistakes that I made, and I am convinced that if I fix one of these 4 mistakes, it's up to the dice. I probably, if everything else otherwise goes identically, which it doesn't, but for the thought experiment, I probably still lose the game by 1 to 3 points, which is very close. Like, that's the difference of a couple dice rolls. If I fix any 2 of these mistakes, I'm convinced I win. And if I win the game, it means I would have won the entire event. So let's go ahead and walk you through. And again, if you want to go watch the entire thing, link is in the description. First mistake. Both armies have pregame actions. His bikes have a pregame move, and I have my 3 redeploys. And they go in an order. You go back and forth, activating one ability per player, starting with the player who won first turn. And Alex won first turn. Now he takes his first bike squad and he moves it, and it basically moves up to the limit of where he is allowed to, because his bikes have to obey a 9-inch bubble with their pregame move around Sentinels. And then I take a Scout Sentinel that I had 4 deployed into the middle of the board, and I redeploy it back from the center of the board to within my deployment zone, which if I want to redeploy it, it has to be within my deployment zone. And this is a colossal mistake because it means that on his first turn, or with his pre-move, these bikes that were previously being held back by the Scout Sentinel's bubble of just existing now effectively get an extra 6 to 8 inches of movement before the game even starts. And on his first turn, these bikes move up, they tag the Sentinel in melee, which I was always kind of expecting to happen, but it ends up costing me 2 command points to fall it back. And they are able to get their chargers off into 2 Leman Russ battle tanks, one of which is the tank commander with Gatekeeper. And that means that they can't shoot into the melee, or they can't shoot out. They're shooting at a -1 into the melee, and their main gun might not be able to shoot at all if it doesn't have any targets. Now, that was a big mistake because it cost me a ton of damage output on turn 1 that I probably didn't. The other thing that happens on turn 1, and this might be a little bit of a mistake, I did pull some of the guardsmen back. And what ends up happening is he takes his Hearthguard and he teleports them turn 1, and they shoot their grenade launchers at my Barbican Ski Kazarkin. And they do some chip damage. I believe they pick up 2 guys with Meltaguns. And then the Hearthguard take their 9-inch charge and they make it into the guardsmen that I had redeployed. And they make their 9-inch charge, which first off is 27.8% to actually make that charge on a single roll. If you have a reroll to it, it goes up to about 45%. But because I had redeployed these guardsmen, the Hearthguard were in a position to actually tag the Rogel Dorn and tag it in melee. And so even though it gets to swing back, it does mean that the Rogel Dorn is 1, move blocked fairly heavily, and 2, is not going to be able to shoot at them with his full ballistic skill. And he can't shoot his main gun at them. And so these 2 units, the Pioneers that tagged 2 Leman Russes and the Hearthguard, they I have to devote my entire first turn to doing almost nothing other than killing them. And while I do clean up the bikes, the Hearthguard are still left with like 2 or 3 models still alive in my deployment zone. And they end up doing a fair amount of damage to my heirloom weapons Kazarkin. They do a fair amount of damage to Lord Solar Leontus, and they just become a massive pain. Now, I don't know. I guess the only thing I could have done is try to make sure that the Hearthguard would not be able to consolidate into my Rogel Thorn battle tank if they get their charge off. But I feel like that was mostly a die roll issue, right? He ends up hitting his 9-inch charge. But I also make mistake number 2, and this is the one that I'm kicking myself for the most after doing it. So on my first turn, I have 1 Scout Sentinel that I had left in the northwest quarter in order to try and prevent the bikes from moving over that direction. And I even go over it and I measure it to make sure that it was in range to fall back, well, not fall back, but to retreat from the position that it was in, to move around this piece of obscuring, and to come around and touch the northwest objective. I go over on my turn 1 and I measure it and just like, yeah, okay, double, triple checked it. It is going to be in range. And I am very, in my mind, I am very clearly like, yeah, make sure you do this. And I don't. I don't actually move it. I only measure it as I'm doing my like command phase planning stage. And this costs me at least at least 6 points in the game. And because the final score is 62 to 69, if I get 6 points there, that's 68 to 69. At least 6 points. Because it means that on my turn 2, I get only 4 points of primary because I'm not holding the northwest objective because I didn't move the sentinel. And also, on my, in this spot, I don't end up controlling the northwest objective at the end of my turn because I don't have anything that can get over there because the sentinel was supposed to be the one doing that. And it's 2 points to control an objective in no man's land. So it cost me 6 points to not move the sentinel after measuring it. And there's not a whole lot more to learn there. It literally just slipped my mind. I think what probably happened was because it was game 5 over the course of 2 days, because I was still kind of in the jittery, nervous part of the game. I don't, when I measure it, I just assume mentally that I had actually moved it. And I don't check after I do all of my shooting. And for a game that ended up being a 7-point deficit, losing 6 points was colossal. And the mistake that is probably most directly attributable to the loss. The other thing that happens on my turn 1 is I take my Barbarian Kazarkin and I teleport them to his backline and I clear off one of the 5-man squads of warriors off of his home objective. And the idea here is that I was trying to deny the more part of the primary, the 1-2 more part. And for what it's worth, they do clear it off, but it doesn't end up mattering because at the beginning of his turn 2 or his turn 3, he's controlling 2 objectives, and because I'm only controlling 1 because I don't move my Scout Sentinel, it ends up being a 10-point swing! It ends up being a 10-point swing because I don't move the Scout Sentinel. And that's crushing. A 10-point swing. The third mistake that I ended up making. On my second turn, I bring in all 3 units of Scions in Deep Strike. And I take 2 of them. I take the ones with the Plasmas and the Meltaguns. And after he had moved his other 5-man squad of warriors to retake his home objective, I drop 2 squads of Scions over there with the idea that they can probably kill 5 warriors on their own. For what it's worth, my Plasma this game rolls absolutely terribly. I end up killing, I think, 5 of my Plasma Gunners. Both Scion Plasma Gunners in this squad in this attack end up killing themselves. I kill another one somewhere else. I kill the other Scion guy ends up killing himself as well, and I have had at least one Kazarkin kill themselves, even with the reroll. I remember Anthony, the producer of the stream, was even like, yeah, at some point we just got to keep like a counter on screen of like how many times Josh actually loses his Plasma Gunners to just rolling ones. But anyway, but I do that. I take 2 to try and knock him off of his home objective. And my third Scion squad, instead of deploying it to the northeast corner of the board, like I did with the 2 that are shooting them off the home objective or trying to, I deep strike them to the northwest corner of the board. And I have that squad in the northwest quarter do retrieve battlefield data. That doesn't sound too bad, right? Like, the retrieve battlefield data goes off. But the reason why this is a colossal mistake is because it denies me 4 points. Because on turn 2, I'm doing the other safe quarter. I'm going to get either the northwest quarter or the southeast quarter, depending on what it is that Alex is going to be screening out. But this was my only chance to do the northeast quarter for retrieve battlefield data. And I never get the northeast quarter off. I never get the southeast quarter off. But I do have a Cadian squad in the northwest quarter of the board that I could have done retrieve battlefield data on turn 3. But because I'd already done that quarter, I can't do it there. And it cost me 4 points. So if you're tracking, for people who are tracking, not moving the Sentinel cost me 6 points, and Alex gained 4 points. Now, he maybe overcaps his primary anyway, um, but it's still 6 points that I didn't gain from primary, and 4 points now that I didn't gain on secondary, for a total of a minimum of 10 points. And if I get 10 points in the game, again, otherwise goes identically, that now puts me in a position where I am up 3 points. Now, most of the rest of the game, Alex has one round of shooting, or one, like, activation of shooting that goes a little bit poorly, and he doesn't end up killing a Leontus battle tank that had 3 judgment tokens on it, and it ends up being left on 4 wounds or something. I believe it was in the middle bracket. And so he goes, oh crap, and pulls everything back. Most of the rest of the game is Alex trying to pick off units of infantry to deny me boots on the ground points, and it actually holds me to 7 points on the secondary in the entire game, which is one of the lowest I've ever scored. And setting up for lay claim in the southeast part of the map, because he's given up on taking anything in the northwest corner, because that's where I put the other 2 objectives, and that's where I could bring all 4 of my living tanks to bear. And anything, because I went second, anything that was on those objectives was going to get shot off. But mistake number 4 was on my 4th turn, I had a Cadian command squad and a Commissar, and I could have given both of them objective secure. Or, because he only ever had a champion on, which is just one model, if I can get both units onto the center objective, I could have scored 4 points by moving those units a little bit closer, making sure that instead of a 6-inch advance that I needed to make in order to get onto the central objective, I only needed to roll a 4 on one of them, right? Instead of needing a 6 on either of them. And because I didn't do that, because I didn't move anything into range where it could actually get on top of the central objective, I prevented myself from even realistically playing for scoring 12 on primary in the last turn. And so, I kind of made the claim earlier. If I fix one of these mistakes, I probably still lose by a couple points if the rest of the game is otherwise identical. If I fix any 2 of these mistakes, I'm in a winning position. But I don't. And I end up losing the game 62-69 in a very close game. And Alex, to his credit, was very, very gracious and a really upstanding guy as well. And by about round 3, I had kind of settled in. I was no longer really nervous by about round 3, but there's a part of me that directly attributes the biggest mistake in not moving the Sentinel on turn 1 to that nervousness, right? To that uncomfortability playing on this top table and playing in front of a bunch of different strong players and playing in front of a stream. And I think that's something that will go away when I continue to play and when I do eventually come back to the hobby for a little while. But Alex, again, top 100 player. At the time of the event, he was ranked 86th on the ITC ladder. And the other thing that was interesting was afterwards he spent a fair amount of time talking about how he prefers win path as a tiebreaker instead of battle points. With the basic idea being, if you have 2 players who both have a 4-1 record, the player who wins their first 4 games and therefore plays up against undefeated players the entire way through the event, should place higher than somebody who lost their first game and then ended up playing up against a player who went, 0-1, then 1-1, then 2-1, etc., right? Because all of those players had lost a game previously. Ultimately, the event was by battle points, and everybody knew that going in, so I was not super surprised that I dropped a couple of places. I actually expected to drop even further after dropping that game. But he did mention, and this made me feel very good, that, 1, I was second in his heart for only losing at the final table, and 2, that he was very impressed at how well I had been doing even in the short time. Because, again, I recently picked up this game again. I had stopped playing in about 2012 to 2013 and only picked this game back up in January. And And the thing that kind of took me aback, and I was like, wow, that is a really generous thing to do, was he offered to use some of his winnings, because he won the entire thing as the only undefeated player, to buy me something as a bit of a consolation prize. And I declined, partly because I was like, I don't need anything right now. I'm waiting for 10th. If that's something you really want to do, I'll let you, but there's nothing in particular. It's like, I really want this or that, or I was planning to use my winnings to get whatever, because I did not expect to even be close to in the money for this event. But it was ultimately a great game, and again, I want to thank Alex for just having a great game and just being a great guy at this event as well. So, now that we're getting into the summary part of it, if you clicked the description or to just jump up ahead to this and skip all of the actual 40k parts of the video, here's a quick summary of everything. I won my first game against Austin's Chaos Demons with a score of 83-68 against a player that I had played against twice before, and have now won our official, unofficial best of 3 across the past couple of events. I won my second game against Robert's Tau 95-75 in one of the slower games that I played, where we didn't do a whole lot of shooting at each other. It was mostly just kind of waiting for the game to end over several turns up against a kind of interesting list. I won game 3, 89-83 against RJ's Tau in a game where I lost the trust of sportsmanship from my opponent, and again, I would like to apologize for that, but it was a game that I did end up winning regardless. I won my fourth game as well, going up against Brian's Custodes in a game that I was very nervous about, in a game that I did not think I was favored to win, because if I go second, I'm probably going to lose. If I go first and I don't get a good first turn off, I'm also like 50-50, not in a great spot to actually play the rest of the game out. But I did end up winning that one. And that took me to the finals, where I ended up playing up against Alex and his Votan. And I lost that one in a very narrow loss, 62 points to 69. And overall, after only losing in finals, after winning my first 4 games, I end the event at 4-1, and I earned myself 4th place, which might surprise some of you people who aren't as familiar with the Warhammer 40k, but because I scored so low, even though it was a close game against Alex's Votan, because the actual score was relatively low, I earned 4th place based on battle points for the tiebreaker. And I went into this event, I had a goal of winning 3 games at the Riverside Classic, and I end up winning 4. I go to the final table, I take on some very strong players. Overall, I took down 2 top 1,000 players, and I lost to a top 100 player. I'm beating good players, and I'm giving really good players close games. And so I'm pretty happy with what the progress I've actually had so far over the past several weeks, or the past like month and a half really, since I've started taking it more seriously. But with that in mind, we will go ahead and give our last part of the video that we've normally been doing. That is the top 100 goal update. Unfortunately, as of this recording, the ITC leaderboard has not been updated with the scores for the event. But based on what I've seen and compared it to other similar events of similar sizes and similar rounds, I'm expecting that I would score somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 points. This would replace my worst event so far of the top 6 that I played, which was the Odyssey Games April RTT, where I went 1 win, 1 loss, and 1 draw, and I ended up getting 19th there, where I earned about 90 points. This would be giving me about plus 60 from what I expect, leaving me with a total of around 790 points, and that would leave my ranking here in the low 200s, somewhere probably between 200 and 220. And that means that I unfortunately did not scratch my way into the top 100 during this ITC season. The closest I got was number 192, which I held briefly after my second event during the course of Joshi's journey. Funnily enough, while that goal ends up becoming a bit of a pipe dream and something that I will not accomplish, I'm still fairly happy with what I have been able to do so far. Even though I was never able to make top 100, I was able to take a bunch of players who are quite strong and give them good games. And ultimately, I think that's the biggest thing that I was really setting out to do, and kind of proving that I could potentially play this game at a high level if I do choose to put the time into it. But there's something funny. There's actually another Josh Howard on the ITC rankings. And They're higher rated than me, which means that I'm currently the worst Josh Howard on the ITC rankings. And this guy is a player who plays over in the UK, and they currently have 796.27 points as of this recording. Before we include this event here, the Riverside Classic, I'm currently sitting at 730.47 points for a total difference of 65.8. Now, as you might have just heard, I'm expecting to be scoring around 150-ish points. But if I score 156.35 points or more from this GT, while I will not have reached my goal of breaking to the top 100, I will at least be the best Joshua Howard in this ITC ranking season. Of course, assuming that the other Josh doesn't play any more games. But we're not going to worry about that too much. If I can at least be better than the other Josh Howard in the other part of the world for at least a little while, then I've done my job. I don't really care, but I think it's funny that I am technically the worst Josh Howard on the ITC rankings. Because every single time I've looked, he's just been like a little bit ahead of me. Like, plus about 30 to 60 points after every single event that I've done. But overall, once again, I just kind of want to thank all of you guys for tuning in week after week to be watching Joshi's journey in 40K. I don't remember if I said this in a previous video, but the Riverside Classic was my last intended event for the rest of the ITC season. During 9th edition, that will probably be my last event that I go to. I might be able to get one or two in if I have a day off on the weekends, but I tend to work Saturdays, Sundays, and Mondays, which makes it rather difficult for me to go to a lot of these events. And so, if I get another event in, I will, of course, make a video about it, but otherwise, I will probably be back into the 40K scene more seriously around October or November, well into 10th edition. I'll be playing in the meantime, but they will be mostly like beer and pretzels games or playing with some buddies. I might get a couple Thursday night fights in with XPZ or, Odyssey or Gameology or whatever it is that they do choose to have those. And I will try to go to those as much as I can. But this will be the end of Joshi's journey into 40K, hopefully Season 1. If you've enjoyed this so far, please go ahead and leave a comment down below. Give a like and a subscription, as again, I will be back at some point. It will probably just be a couple of months before we start making more content. And if my buddy Steve, who I lost to at the last event, has anything to say about it, we will be putting out some silly content at some point in the next couple of weeks. But if we can get that to go through, we will, of course, let you know. So for now, this has been Joshua Joshi Howard. We've been going over Joshi's journey and how we got 4-1 and only lost at the final table to Spatho in a very close game. So for now, we will be signing out and seeing you next time. Get out of here.